All right. So my first question for the book is I want to begin with that concluding idea because I think some Christians hear the word poetic or imagination and they think we mean fiction or imaginary. They're afraid that if we talk about reading the life of Christ as poetry or as art, then we're going to become like that progressive Anglican priest in the Great Divorce who has literally been to hell, but still only thinks of it as, a beautiful idea. So why do you think, or have you found that modern Christians tend to understand reading something poetically as somehow opposed to reading it literally? And why do you think that is? And what are you talking about when you say, let's look at Jesus as a divine work of art?
Right. I think I understand that worry. Obviously, we live in a world where many of our churches have abandoned the entire idea of the supernatural. They've abandoned the idea of facing Jesus head on as if he was really saying what he was saying. On the other hand, I think that literalism, St. Paul says that the letter kills and the spirit gives life. And I think literalism actually reduces Christ to something much smaller than I experience him as being. I mean, I always remind myself of this. You're dealing with the king of the universe who has put himself in this position of being humiliated, tortured, and killed. There must have been a reason for that. It wasn't to tell you to be a good boy, and it wasn't to tell you don't judge people hypocritically. Like he was actually saying, must have been saying something that was quite radical, quite explosive. And every time I have connected with that and come to understand it in what you might call a poetic way, and that suddenly you just knew what it meant. You couldn't explain it. You might not be able to repeat it. You might not be able to translate it, but you just knew. I found that every time that happened to me, my life became more joyful. And by that, I don't mean happier. I mean more intense, more awake, more alert, and that it stayed that way. In other words, it would go up a notch and just remain at that notch because I now had a new way of looking at things. And so when I'm talking about poetry, you could almost say that the comparing Christ to poetry is itself poetry, or at least a metaphor, because what I'm talking about is that triune connection, a Trinitarian connection between an idea which can't be expressed, for instance, God the Father, something that we cannot comprehend, and a metaphor, a representation of that idea, namely Jesus Christ, something we can see and relate to as human being to human being. As he said, you are now my friends. We can relate to him as a person. And that mystical connection between knowing the representation of the unknowable idea and the unknowable idea so that it comes to life in you. And that, I think, is the Holy Spirit within you. And that triple emotion, I think, is repeated throughout life in all kinds of ways. So that, for instance, if you give a beggar bread, or if you torture a child, those actions represent good and evil. And connect to those things. And the great question, when you lose God, you lose that supernatural meaning. So really, what's the difference between giving a beggar bread and torturing a child? There is none. What's the difference between cutting up a healthy child to change its gender and leaving them alone to develop into life? There is no difference. And so Jesus really creates that entire connection with a supernatural world of meaning that our bodies only represent, including the meaning of our bodies, which is ourself.